I'm making this video a week after I intended to release it. Originally, I was going to talk about money, about the financial prospects of content creators from both the left and the right online today. But in the light of many recent events, I feel that I have to slightly change the subject, and I need to make this video about storytelling, about narratives, and about how those narratives construct the framework for power. Of course, money does play a role in this. But it's complicated, and it contains a lesson that the right, or really any counter-progressive force, is going to need to learn if they want to make any inroads against the progressive mainstream. But perhaps I need to back up a little bit. For anyone who may have been away from the internet for a little while, or at least away from YouTube, the elephant in the room, the motivating event for this video, at least in its current form, is Patreon's decision to deplatform a number of right-wing content creators, among them Milo Yiannopoulos, Sargon of Akkad, and James Allsup. These three creators between themselves had made not insignificant amounts of money from the platform of Patreon. In Sargon's case, and I think James Allsup's case as well, Patreon constituted a majority of these content creators' incomes. And with a single decision, Patreon CEO Jack Conte removed that income stream from them. And what were the pretenses for these decisions? What was the reason given? Well, really nothing having to do with the terms of service. In the case of Sargon, the reason for the removal of his income stream amounted to a single profanity, said not on Patreon, not even on his channel, but on the livestream of a third party. The profanity, while crude, was meant to be satirical, and in no way violated the Patreon terms of service. The same could be said for Yiannopoulos and Allsup, whose offenses seemed to amount to little more than their association with the Proud Boys, which are a right-wing group that has been the subject of a bit of a moral panic on the part of the mainstream left in the last month. Again, guilt by association is not in the Patreon terms of service. I remember seeing these removals and thinking that they should mark a turning point with how all counter-progressive people see the culture war playing out online, with how all people who are not comfortable with the progressive mainstream conceptualize their struggle against both the media and the technology companies that support the mainstream media. Of course, we've had arbitrary bannings from Twitter before. We know that these tech companies are not neutral actors. We know that they regularly violate their terms of service. And of course, this is not the first time that Jack Conte at Patreon has pulled these shenanigans before. People might remember something similar playing out with Lauren Southern and Faith Goldy almost a year earlier. But this time I think things are different, really because of the fact that people's livelihoods were involved. This wasn't simply the throttling of a voice online. This was the termination of an income. Sargon essentially got fired from a job that paid him $12,000 to $15,000 a month. And that's huge. That can't be ignored. Certainly not on the part of Sargon, but also for people who are interested in resisting big media and big tech's attempt to throttle conversation online. Now, of course, people listening to this will understand that I'm rather late to the kill on this one. Anyone watching YouTube in the last week has noticed that there has been a tsunami of outrage in the wake of Sargon's banning from Patreon. And of course, there were some naysayers, some people who felt that Sargon had got what was coming to him for counter-signaling the right and participating in some petty internet dramas. But having the opportunity to sit back and witness the reaction to these most recent Patreon bannings, not being able to make a response myself due to traveling, I began to suspect that a lot of people who were reacting, both those who supported Sargon and those who were naysayers, didn't really understand what was at stake. Why Sargon and Milo's banning from Patreon was, in some sense, so important to Jack Conte, that it seems he was willing to risk his entire business model in order to carry it out. Most people reacting to the Sargon ban reacted to it as an attack on Sargon the individual. If you liked Sargon or thought he did reasonably good work, or felt that his political positions were more or less aligned to your own, you were rightly outraged at this attack against free speech. And moreover, you thought that the attack on Sargon's main income stream was outrageous. If you didn't like Sargon, it was good riddance, a comeuppance. Let's hope there's a better voice to represent us in the future. But all of this on both sides is really aside from the point. We haven't answered the fundamental question. Why did people like Jack Conte ban Sargon of Akkad? Believe it or not, Sargon's actual opinions aren't that unacceptable even in Silicon Valley. So why was it done? The answer has less to do, I think, with political perspective, with opinion, or with message, and everything to do with narrative. Sargon was banned to preserve a kind of narrative that people in big media and big tech are very, very invested in preserving. And that narrative is that those who try to head up political movements or alternative media forums on YouTube are unprofessional hacks and edgelords that eventually get their comeuppance when responsible watchdogs and responsible media managers enter the conversation. The narrative that what remains to counter progressive media online is little more than an unending stream of juvenile content creators and adults behaving like juvenile content creators, producing flash-in-the-pan reactionary content with no larger substance before finally self-immolating in a catastrophe of their own making, before finally being clamped down by the responsible parties that need to ensure media quality and honesty. The narrative that there is no quality, long-lasting, activist force that can be trusted to persist online or in real life. In short, Sargon was banned so that there could be a million communications that sound something like this.
It was Sargon's Patreon and it had been shut down. So that happened today. Isn't that interesting? Instant karma's gonna get you. Gonna knock you right in the head. So I'm gonna go into the office and occasionally remember that Sargon got himself kicked off of Patreon. Free market capitalism at work. There you go. Love it or leave it, Carl. Love it or leave it.
This battle is a battle over narrative, over who gets to tell the story of counter-progressive voices in alternative media. And it's this narrative that people like Jack Conte are very invested in. More so, it seems, than the bottom line of their own company. You could see last year that Jack Conte was testing the water for something like this, seeing exactly how far the censorship envelope could be pushed with Lauren Southern before moving on to what I think are the real targets, the everyday creators on YouTube that profess a counter-progressive persuasion online. When I finally got the news about Sargon and heard about his communications to the Patreon executives, the figure of Jack Conte became immediately fascinating to me. What kind of corporate executive takes these kind of risks with his company's reputation in order to pursue a political narrative, in order to pursue a cultural narrative? Strangely enough, as I looked into the figure of Jack Conte, I realized that he wasn't the man I thought he was. I expected, like most Silicon Valley companies, that the founder would have been some tech expert, someone from either an engineering or a business community who had struck it rich with an original idea, largely contrived out of technical perfection, out of business acumen. Instead, in Jack Conte, what I found was a career that had begun on YouTube as a YouTube content creator, as somebody who was very, very good at self-promotion, and very, very good about constructing a narrative around self-promotion. In short, Jack Conte understood what it was like to be a creator. He understands what makes a creator successful, what makes a brand successful. And immediately the puzzle started to fall into place. Jack Conte got where he is right now, not because he invented something amazing, not because he took a crazy risk, but because he was really good at telling good stories about himself. He presented an image, something to believe in. He's the guy that at a cocktail party could give you that classic 5-minute elevator pitch that would make you really, really involved in his own personal projects. And that's what made Patreon a success. Jack Conte understood the power of a narrative. And I think that's the reason why He's been so proactive in attempting to destroy the counter-narrative of the right. And destroying that counter-narrative begins with people like Sargon, with people like Milo, regardless of how much you might like or dislike their content. People want to know what the story of Sargon of Akkad is. He's a man that started a YouTube channel coming out of a shit cubicle job and made a name for himself. So how does the story end? What becomes of Sargon, Carl Benjamin, ultimately? That's the critical piece of the narrative that everyone wants to know. If people are going to follow Sargon, become online activists, become a voice in what is really turning out to be the front page of all conversations, the internet, if a person is going to take that route, to pursue that lifestyle, what will they learn from looking at the story of Sargon of Akkad? Is it a tale of triumph or tragedy? On this channel, I've talked a lot about the power of narratives to move people, to make political action possible, to open up new horizons, to make people think in different ways, and also to shut down avenues of thought, to create mental blocks, and to ensure that some power structures are never really questioned. I make a big deal about this, but it seems that whenever one of these situations appears, again and again, people forget that it's the narrative that matters. There is a character and a moment in the HBO TV series Game of Thrones, and also in the book series A Song of Ice and Fire, that I find myself going back to. In this story, a master strategist and nobleman, one Tywin Lannister, played in the HBO series deftly by Charles Dance, is attempting to shore up his own family's waning power base and prestige among the other noble families. In doing so, he understands that the most important thing to have is a story about why other people should respect you, about why other people should take you seriously, about how you should command respect. The amount of money you have, the amount of military men under your command is important to an extent. But at the end of the day, power lies in the narrative, in the stories that people believe. One scene in particular stands out from this character when he explains why he is so concerned about the abduction of his malformed youngest son, Tyrion, even though he really despises his son at a personal level.
I didn't realize you place such a high value on my brother's life.
He's a Lannister. He might be the lowest of the Lannisters, but he's one of us. And every day that he remains a prisoner, the less our name commands respect.
So the Lion does concern himself with the opinions
No, that's not an opinion, it's a fact. If another house can seize one of our own and hold him captive with impunity, we are no longer a house to be feared.
And that, after everything, is the fact. If someone from your group, if someone from your project can be easily destroyed by your enemies, then your entire group's right to exist, its entire dignity, its entire basis of power and respect is called into question. You may not like that particular person. You may think that the work they do is, quite honestly, very shoddy and even a little bit embarrassing. But if your common enemies can reach out and destroy that person, then you yourself are next on the chopping block. Your presence as a political entity no longer commands respect in any meaningful way. This, more than anything else, is the reason why Sargon and Milo's removal from Patreon means so much to Jack Conte, and why it needs to mean so much to us, more than just something that happened to Sargon. This is about what it means to be a counter-progressive political activist online in the year 2018. Is this something to be respected? Is this something that leads people to respectable careers, to achievement and satisfaction for parties who we might not agree with, but we nonetheless see as colleagues in a common struggle? If we want another generation of counter-progressive activists, this narrative needs to be established. This narrative needs to be widely known and understood. And that's what's at stake. Now, of course, before I end this video, I have to provide one rather lengthy digression. Before the whole controversy concerning Sargon's Patreon broke last week, I was in the process of composing another video concerning funding and activism online in 2018, and this largely concerned the Patreon donations YouTubers got versus the number of views they brought in. After looking at the Patreon donations to ContraPoints and Sean and Jen, I got the inkling that despite their weaker presence in terms of total views, progressive YouTube was much better funded. So, sure enough, I did an unofficial study on the matter, looking at a very small sample size of 12 conservative or counter-progressive YouTubers and 12 progressive YouTubers to see how their Patreon earnings and views matched up. Of course, since not everyone's Patreon earnings were entirely explicit, and given that total monthly views oscillate over time, a certain amount of eyeballing needed to be done. But nevertheless, even with the most conservative estimates, when I tallied everything together, I discovered that progressive YouTubers, progressive content creators, made 4 to 5 times the amount of dollars per YouTube view than did their conservative and counter-progressive counterparts. This relationship held up even controlling for quality of the output, with high-quality progressive YouTubers like ContraPoints still earning several times the number of Patreon dollars per viewer than a high-quality counter-progressive content creator like Black Pigeon Speaks. An indication that it is enormously more lucrative to be a progressive online content creator than it is to be a conservative one. Now, of course, I was going to expand this study, refine my methodology, try to draw in a bigger sample size, but of course, this project is more or less kaput this week, considering that over half of the counter-progressive YouTube creators have flat out dumped Patreon. Still, I think the general observation still stands and cries out for an explanation. Why is it more lucrative to be a progressive YouTuber than it is to be a conservative one, even though progressive YouTube brings in many, many fewer views? The answer might lie in conservatives and progressives' differing opinions towards charity and how it applies to activism. There have, of course, been many, many psychological studies on just this difference between the two ideological groups. But at this moment, I'm thinking in a very different way. Perhaps the answer is narrative. The narrative that conservative and counter-progressive YouTubers tell about themselves, and the narrative that the fans of conservatives and counter-progressive YouTubers take. Progressives are way better at this game, and I really don't think that's a controversial statement. Just looking down the list I compiled, I found myself asking, on the progressive end, what is the story of ContraPoints? What is the story of Innuendo Studios? What is the story of Christy Winters? Those questions all had really easy answers. They had easy answers because, for the most part, the channel spent most of their time communicating that narrative. What's the story of ContraPoints? Well, ContraPoints is a brave trans woman who's speaking out against the bullshit propagated every day by online shitlords on YouTube. They're the brave voice of progressivism online. What's the story of Christy Winters? Well, she's the intrepid intellectual who has all the answers. And so on and so on and so on. But when you get right down to it, all of the counter-progressive voices, the narrative is a lot harder to see. The presentation doesn't include the story of these characters, how they're heroic, how we're supposed to look up or admire them. Perhaps this is intellectually more honest. But let me just ask you, what is the story of Sargon of Akkad? He's a guy that makes videos. Sometimes they're a little bit funny. Sometimes you agree with them. Sometimes he pushes back against the right people, but that's pretty much it. What's the story of Aidan Paladin, a rogue intellectual who likes explaining sociological papers in the light of political controversy? Still not a very sexy story. Again, for myself personally, I think that the focus on argument over narrative might lead to many more honest discussions, might lead to a more effective interchange of ideas. But in the end, something critical is missing. I'm not saying that Aidan Paladin or Sargon need to start creating mythologies for themselves, creating superficial images that they can inhabit the way that ContraPoints does for themselves. That would likely be counterproductive and not a little cringe. But at the same time, the community, what we are doing here on YouTube, opposing the progressive mainstream, needs to develop a narrative for itself, needs to develop a story about what it's doing, why it's important, and why eventually we should win and will win. Because I think at the end of the day, this is what people like Jack Conte fear the most. The possibility that people who see things in a fundamentally different way than he does start developing a story about themselves, about how they have dignity that needs to be respected, about how the path of counter-progressive activism does have a happy ending, a sustainable future. Because if that narrative becomes real, if that story becomes told, I think Jack Conte's own power is threatened. 2 weeks ago, Jack Conte was the brilliant YouTube creator who turned his passion for making content into entrepreneurial energy to the point where he became the CEO of a very successful Silicon Valley company. But this story might not last. And if all of us here who have their livelihoods on the line, or who enjoy viewing content from creators of a counter-progressive disposition, are able to get their story heard, then the story of Jack Conte might start looking a lot more tragic. Less the creative force that founded a Silicon Valley company, more the foolhardy ideologue who had the world in his hand and threw it all away to pursue a vindictive political vanity project. And with that, I wish you all good night and good luck in the coming battles ahead.